Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo today.
Yeah, things are pretty intense over there.
That's putting it mildly. It's been a really volatile situation for years, especially in the eastern part of the country.
Right, and it's gotten even more complicated lately with the resurgence of the M23 rebel group.
We're going to try to unpack all of that, but for this deep, guys, we're focusing on one particular perspective, Rwandan President Paul Kagame.
Exactly, and our main source material is his recent interview with Jeune Afrique.
I got to say, it's a pretty revealing interview. Kagame doesn't hold back.
He really doesn't. It gives us a fascinating glimpse into his justifications for Rwanda's actions and his take on the whole crisis.
Okay, so let's set the stage a bit. The eastern DRC has been in a security crisis for years, like we said, and the M23 rebel group is kind of back with a vengeance.
Yeah, they are, and Rwanda has been accused of supporting them, which they of course deny.
Of course, and this has, shall we say, strained relations between Rwanda and the DRC.
To put it mildly. And that brings us to the Dar es Salaam summit, which was supposed to be this big step towards peace.
Right, a chance for everyone to come together and, find a way forward.
Well, Kagame had some pretty interesting things to say about that summit.
Yeah, it seemed like he liked the overall goal, the idea of working towards peace,
Yeah.
but he also kind of threw some shade at Congolese President Tshisekedi
Yeah, he did.
for not being, fully present at the summit and for preferring a military solution over dialogue.
It's interesting, right? Because it seems like Kagame's hinting at this deep distrust of Tshisekedi's approach to the conflict.
Do you think so?
I think it's more than just, oh, he missed part of the summit. It's like there's a fundamental difference in how they view the whole peace process.
That's a good point. And then there's Kagame's response to the summit's call for, everyone to just sit down and talk, including the Congolese government and the M23.
Right, like direct negotiations.
Exactly. He wasn't exactly jumping for joy at that idea.
Yeah, this is where his perspective gets really interesting. He's not completely against negotiations, but he really pushes back against the demands for Rwanda to withdraw its forces and stop taking what he calls quote-unquote defensive measures.
And this is where things get really interesting.
This is where the plot thickens.
Because Kagame insists that the conflict is purely a Congolese affair and that Rwanda isn't involved at all.
Right, and he's very adamant about this.
But that contradicts a lot of reports from the UN and other groups like human rights organizations that suggest otherwise.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence pointing to Rwandan involvement.
So what's going on here? Is Kagame just, straight up lying?
Well, it's hard to say for sure. I mean, we don't have access to all the intelligence or behind-the-scenes maneuvering.
Right.
But it seems like he's trying to control the narrative, to shape how the international community views Rwanda's role.
It's like a PR campaign.
Yeah, kind of. He's pushing back against years of accusations and trying to reframe the situation. He wants to present Rwanda as the victim, not the aggressor.
Okay, so he's trying to paint a different picture. That makes sense, especially when you consider all the historical baggage that Rwanda carries.
Oh, absolutely. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 is a huge part of this. Kagame repeatedly emphasizes that Rwanda has been caught in this conflict for 3 decades now. For him, this isn't just about politics, it's deeply personal. He brings up multiple agreements that Rwanda has signed with the DRC since 2007, agreements that he says the DRC never honored.
So he feels like Rwanda has been betrayed.
Exactly. And he's particularly furious about the presence of the FDLR in the DRC.
Okay, hold on. Who are the FDLR again? I know we've talked about them before, but just a quick refresher for our listeners.
Sure, the FDLR, or the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, is a Hutu militia, and some of its members were actually involved in the Rwandan genocide.
Oh, wow. So that's a huge issue for Rwanda.
It is, and it's a major source of tension between the two countries. Kagame is basically saying that the DRC isn't doing enough to deal with a group that threatens Rwanda's very existence.
So he's using that to justify his actions in the DRC, like we have to protect ourselves.
Exactly, and this ties into his broader frustration with international actors. He's really critical of European powers, especially Belgium and Germany.
What's his beef with them?
He accuses them of being biased against Rwanda and questioning their silence on the DRC's alleged use of European mercenaries.
So he's calling out what he sees as a double standard, like you're quick to condemn Rwanda, but you ignore what the DRC is doing.
Precisely. And it's not just about the FDLR either. He broadens his criticism to include the presidents of both Burundi and the DRC.
Whoa, he's going after everyone.
He accuses them of deliberately stirring up trouble to destabilize Rwanda.
Wow. So he's suggesting this isn't just about internal Congolese issues, but like a deliberate regional strategy against Rwanda.
Yeah, it's a pretty serious accusation, and it raises the question of why he would make such a claim. Is it a genuine belief, a strategic move to deflect blame, or maybe a combination of both?
That's a good question. Something to think about as we go deeper into this. Now, let's talk about the M23 and Rwanda's alleged support for them. This is where Kagame's interview gets really interesting.
Yeah, this is juicy stuff.
He doesn't shy away from expressing sympathy for the M23.
Not at all.
In fact, he kind of frames them as protectors of a persecuted group within the DRC, specifically the community there, with Rwandan origins.
Right, he says they face discrimination from the Congolese government, and he's appealing to this sense of human rights and self-defense to justify any potential support.
So he's trying to shift the narrative away from Rwanda being the aggressor to these people being forced to fight for their survival.
Absolutely, and he goes even further by launching a full-on critique of the Congolese government itself.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's he saying?
He accuses them of collaborating with other armed groups, like the Wazalendo.
I've heard of them. They're pretty notorious, right?
Yeah, they've been linked to some pretty horrific massacres, and Kagame alleges that these massacres were fueled by ethnic tensions and that the Congolese government was complicit.
Wow, those are strong accusations. I bet he ties this back to the M23 somehow, right?
You bet. He brings up the M23's rebellion against Kinshasa back in 2012 and 2013, and he questions why there hasn't been a lasting solution.
It's like he's saying that the DRC hasn't learned from the past and is making the same mistakes all over again.
Exactly. It's a condemnation of the Congolese government's handling of these issues, both past and present. He's essentially saying that they're the real problem, not Rwanda.
Okay, but here's what I don't get. If Kagame insists that Rwanda isn't involved, why doesn't he just let the Congolese figure things out on their own? Why get involved at all?
He addresses that directly in the interview. He claims that if the Congolese government hadn't mistreated this community with Rwandan origins, hadn't collaborated with groups hostile to Rwanda, things wouldn't have escalated in the first place.
So he's justifying Rwanda's actions as a response to provocation and threats, like, we were forced to act.
Exactly. He's flipping the script. And then there's the whole issue of the FDLR.
Right, the group that was involved in the genocide.
Kagame completely rejects the idea that the Congolese army is effectively dealing with them.
He doesn't believe they're being neutralized.
Nope. He claims they're still a threat, even launching attacks on Rwandan territory as recently as 2019 and 2022.
Oh, wow.
He's basically waving a giant red flag saying, see, this is a real problem that you're ignoring while you blame us.
Okay, that's pretty intense. It's like he's highlighting a double standard. Rwanda gets condemned, while the FDLR gets a pass.
And it's a powerful way to frame his argument, even if it might not be the whole picture.
We're really starting to see Kagame's frustration, his sense of injustice. This isn't just about the present. It's about decades of what he sees as unfair treatment.
Definitely something to keep in mind as we continue to unpack all of this. Now, let's move on to a really sensitive topic, the M23's goal of overthrowing President Tshisekedi.
Yeah, that's a big one. What does Kagame have to say about that?
Well, he doesn't explicitly endorse their goal.
Like, go get him, guys.
Right, it's not that straightforward. But he expresses understanding for their rebellion, calling Tshisekedi's government illegitimate and painting a picture of a corrupt, repressive regime.
So he's not saying to overthrow him, but he's also not saying don't overthrow him.
It's this subtle dance. He's walking a fine line, not directly supporting the M23's ultimate aim, but suggesting that their actions are, understandable given the circumstances.
And he really drives the point home by accusing Tshisekedi of seizing power just for his own benefit, creating a corrupt and oppressive system. It's a powerful appeal to fairness and justice.
It makes you think, well, maybe they do have a right to resist. But again, remember, this is just one perspective.
Right. We'll definitely be exploring other viewpoints later in our deep dive. But for now, it seems like for Kagame, this isn't just about security or historical grievances.
It's deeper than that.
It's about the very legitimacy of the Congolese government. He's making a moral argument as well.
Exactly. And it sets the stage for his take on all the attempts at mediating this conflict.
Oh, yeah, like the meeting that Engel and President Lorenzo organized in Rwanda.
Yeah, that one. Well, Kagame didn't even show up.
He completely skipped it. Why?
He claims it was basically a setup designed to get him to agree to points that benefited Kinshasa without any real chance for genuine negotiation.
He felt like it was rigged.
Basically, he accused Kinshasa of blocking key issues from being discussed, so he felt like the whole thing was pointless.
So he saw it as a charade, not a real effort to find a solution.
Exactly. And this just reinforces his overall distrust of the Congolese government and the international community's attempts to mediate.
It's like he's saying, I'll talk, but only on my term. Only if he believes it will lead to a just outcome, from his perspective.
Right. And this leads us to the M23's offensive on Goma, which is a major city in eastern DRC.
Yeah, that was a big deal. Over 3,000 people died in that fighting. Things got really heated.
They did. So how did Kagame respond to that?
You tell me.
Well, he denied any Rwandan involvement in the attacks, claiming they only took defensive measures.
Defensive. But the UN and others have confirmed that Rwandan troops were present in the DRC. How does he explain that?
He basically dismisses those reports. He accuses certain countries, the one who are pointing fingers at Rwanda, of being hypocritical. He's like, you need to deal with the FDLR threat and Kinshasa's attacks on Rwandan territory before you come after us.
So he's prioritizing Rwanda's security above all else, even if it means denying what others see as clear evidence.
Absolutely. It's a bold stance, and it sets the stage for potential international sanctions against Rwanda, which is something we'll be discussing in more detail later on.
This is getting more and more complex. Kagame is a really shrewd strategist, weaving together history, politics, and even morality to justify his actions.
He is, and it's important to remember that this is just one perspective on a very, very complicated situation.
Right, we'll be exploring other viewpoints in our deep dive. Stay tuned for that.
It's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, buckle up. Wow, I'm still processing all of that.
Yeah, Kagame's perspective is definitely something.
It's eye-opening, for sure. He's presenting Rwanda as like this misunderstood country that's been wronged and forced to defend itself.
He's really good at crafting a narrative.
He is, but as you said before, this is just one side of the story.
One piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. We can't just take Kagame's word as gospel, right?
Absolutely not. To really understand this conflict, we need to look at it from all angles.
Okay, so let's start piecing this puzzle together. What are some of the other perspectives we need to consider?
Well, first and foremost, we got to hear from the Congolese government.
Right, they've been pretty quiet in our discussion so far.
Yeah, but their perspective is crucial. I mean, they're the ones on the receiving end of a lot of these accusations.
That's true. So how do they view Rwanda's involvement? And what about their efforts to deal with the FDLR, the group that Kagame is so worried about?
Well, the Congolese government has consistently maintained that Rwanda is actively supporting the M23 rebels, despite Kagame's denials.
So they see it as aggression, not self-defense.
Exactly. And they argue that they are taking steps to deal with the FDLR.
Okay, so they're not just ignoring the problem.
No, but they also say it's a really complicated situation. The eastern DRC is a vast, densely forested region with tons of armed groups operating there.
Right, it's not an easy place to control.
Neutralizing one group, especially one that's been entrenched for decades, is a huge challenge.
I could see how that would be incredibly difficult. So it's like the Congolese government is saying, we're doing what we can, but don't underestimate the challenges we face.
Yeah, and they're also pretty critical of the international community's focus on Rwanda.
What do you mean?
They feel like it lets the DRC off the hook for its own internal problems. It's like everyone's so focused on what Rwanda's doing that they ignore the DRC's own responsibility for the situation.
So it's a blame game, each side pointing fingers at the other.
Pretty much. And that's part of what makes this conflict so hard to resolve. There's this deep-seated mistrust between the two countries.
Years of conflict, historical grievances, it all adds up.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated, there are other actors involved.
You're talking about other armed groups operating in the region.
Yeah, and regional powers like Uganda and Burundi who have their own interests in the DRC.
Right, they're not just innocent bystanders.
Nope. And then there's the role of the international community, especially the UN, which has a peacekeeping mission in the DRC.
So it's not just a two-sided conflict. It's like a giant web with all these different players and competing interests.
Exactly. It's a multi-layered mess, and that's why it's so important to avoid simplistic narratives.
Like Rwanda is bad or the DRC is good.
Right. It's not that simple. The reality is far more nuanced.
We can't just label one side as the villain and the other as the victim.
Nope. Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about Kagame and the Congolese government, but what about the M23 themselves? They're the ones on the ground actually fighting. What are they fighting for?
Yeah, that's a good point. What's their perspective on all of this?
Well, the M23 claims to be fighting for the rights of the Congolese Tutsi community.
Okay, the Tutsi community.
They say they're marginalized and discriminated against by the Congolese government, and they're demanding things like greater political representation, security, economic opportunities.
So their motivations are tied to ethnicity and this sense of exclusion.
Yeah, there are some parallels to what Kagame was saying about the community with Rwandan origins facing discrimination.
Right, right.
But of course, the Congolese government sees things very differently. They argue that the M23 is basically a Rwandan proxy, a tool used by Kigali to destabilize the DRC.
Ah, so we're back to accusations of Rwandan interference.
Yep, and this brings up another layer of complexity, the role of resources.
Resources, you mean like oil or something?
Not quite oil, but something just as valuable. Minerals. The DRC is incredibly rich in minerals like coltan, cobalt, copper, all essential for electronics and high-tech products.
So it's not just about political power and historical grievances, but also about controlling these valuable resources.
Exactly. These economic factors add a whole other dimension to the conflict, making it even harder to untangle.
And let's not forget about the people who are caught in the middle of all this.
Oh, absolutely. We can't lose sight of the human cost of this conflict.
It's easy to get caught up in the political maneuvering and the strategic calculations, but ultimately, this is about real people whose lives are being destroyed.
People who are being displaced from their homes, losing loved ones, living with the constant fear of violence.
Their stories are crucial for understanding the true impact of this conflict, the suffering that often gets overshadowed by the bigger geopolitical picture.
And it's through their experiences that we can really grasp the complexity of this situation. The historical trauma, the political machinations, the economic exploitation, the everyday struggles for survival.
So as we continue to delve into this, we're going to be faced with some really tough questions, some conflicting information, and some heartbreaking realities.
That's the nature of this conflict, unfortunately.
But I think it's important to remember that we're all on a journey of learning here.
It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in a thoughtful conversation, and ultimately trying to find a path towards peace.
And it's about recognizing that peace building is a long and difficult process. It takes time, empathy, and a willingness to listen to all sides.
Well said. Now, before we move on, let's talk a bit more about those potential consequences we mentioned earlier.
The threat of sanctions against Rwanda.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on it, but what might those sanctions actually look like, and what kind of impact could they have on the region?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure how sanctions work in practice.
Well, as we said before, they can be a powerful tool, but they can also backfire.
Right, like making things worse instead of better.
Exactly. If sanctions are imposed on Rwanda, it could make their economy even worse. Cause more hardship for the people.
And wouldn't that risk making the conflict even worse? Like pushing people to extremes?
It's definitely a possibility, and sanctions could also isolate Rwanda internationally, pushing them closer to countries that maybe don't have the best track record on human rights.
So it's a risky move. There's no guarantee that sanctions will actually work, and they could even backfire.
Right, and we can't forget that the DRC is already incredibly fragile. More instability could be devastating for the people there, leading to more displacement, more humanitarian crises, maybe even more conflict.
The stakes are so high.
They are, and it reminds us that this conflict isn't just a regional issue, it's connected to global politics and economics. What happens in the DRC doesn't stay in the DRC.
It has ripple effects.
Exactly. And that's why we need to approach this situation with a lot of humility and caution.
Our actions, even with good intentions, can have unintended consequences.
That's right. We need to act wisely and prioritize the well-being of the people who are most affected by this conflict.
Which means listening to all sides, understanding the root causes of the problem, and working towards a just and peaceful solution.
Well said. Now, speaking of listening to all sides, Kagame's interview really highlighted how he views the international community.
Yeah, he seemed to feel like Rwanda is being treated unfairly, held to a different standard.
He definitely has a chip on his shoulder about that.
He kept accusing certain countries of hypocrisy, pointing to their silence on the DRC's actions while they condemn Rwanda.
And he seemed to have a particular issue with European powers, like Belgium and Germany.
Right, he brought up their history in the region a lot.
And it's important to remember that these historical grievances run deep. The legacy of colonialism, especially Belgium's brutal rule in both Rwanda and the DRC, is still very much present.
So we can't just ignore the past. It's still shaping the present.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand that historical context. The wounds of the past haven't healed, and they continue to influence how people see each other, how they act.
It makes me wonder if part of the solution is like a truth and reconciliation process, a way to acknowledge past injustices and start to build a more equitable future.
That's a really interesting idea, something to think about. Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have. It's a lot to take in.
It is, and I can imagine our listener might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
But I think it's important to acknowledge that feeling. This conflict is incredibly complex, and there's no shame in feeling overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information, the difficult questions it raises.
It's okay to feel confused, frustrated, even angry.
Exactly. And as we continue our deep dive, I think it's helpful to remember that we're all learning together here.
It's not about reaching definitive conclusions or taking sides. It's about expanding our understanding and having a nuanced conversation, and recognizing that peace building is a long and difficult process. It requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to listen to everyone involved. So much to think about with this conflict.
It's really a deep one.
Yeah, we've explored Kagame's perspective and the Congolese government side and even the M23's motivations.
A lot of moving pieces.
Exactly. But you've been saying all along that this goes way beyond just Rwanda and the DRC.
Oh, for sure. And a big part of that is the international community. We talk about how some countries have suspended aid to Rwanda, and there's even talk about tougher sanctions.
Sanctions? I've been wondering about those. Could they backfire? I mean, Rwanda's already facing a tough economic situation.
It's definitely a risk. Sanctions can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Right.
They could make things even tougher for ordinary Rwandans, and, well, that could lead to more instability and resentment.
And wouldn't that just make the conflict even worse?
It's a real possibility. Plus, sanctions could push Rwanda closer to, let's say, less democratic countries.
The ones who don't really care about human rights.
Yeah, those ones. So Rwanda might end up isolated from its traditional allies and forced to turn to less savory partners.
And that could make everything even more complicated.
Oh, absolutely. Finding a peaceful solution would be even harder.
It's a real dilemma.
It is, and we can't forget about the DRC. It's already one of the poorest and most fragile countries in the world.
Yeah.
More instability there could be devastating.
More people displaced from their homes, more humanitarian crises.
Exactly. We could even see more conflict break out.
This all just feels so heavy. It's heartbreaking to think about the people caught in the middle of this.
I know. It's easy to get lost in the politics and strategy and forget about the real human cost.
The fear, the loss, the families torn apart.
It's crucial to remember that we're talking about real lives here.
Real people.
Yes, and peace isn't just about stopping the fighting. It's about creating a world where people can live with dignity and security.
Where they have a chance at a future.
Right. And achieving that kind of peace takes a lot more than just, signing a treaty.
It's about tackling the root causes.
Exactly. The historical grievances, the poverty, the political exclusion, all of it.
It's such a long and complicated process.
It is, and it has to come from within. We can't force peace on people.
So what can we do? What's the takeaway for our listeners?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this isn't a simple story.
Right. There's no good guy, bad guy situation here.
Rwanda and the DRC have both made mistakes.
And powerful countries outside the region have their own interests at hand.
We have to look at this from all angles.
Don't fall for easy answers.
And never forget the power of history. The Rwandan genocide, the decades of instability in the DRC, that all casts a very long shadow.
It shapes everything.
So as we wrap up, I think it's worth asking ourselves, whose voices are missing from this conversation? What other perspectives do we need to understand?
And what can we do as informed citizens to help bring about a more just and peaceful future for everyone involved?
Those are the real questions we should all be grappling with.
Well said. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but this conversation is far from over.
We encourage everyone to keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep engaging with this complex and vitally important issue.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time, 23-5.